Which statement accurately describes the ordinary legislative procedure, OLP, in the context of the EU's legislative process? A. The European Commission proposes new legislation, which then requires unanimous approval by the European Parliament only. B. Legislation is proposed by the European Parliament and must be approved by the European Council by a simple majority. C. The European Council proposes legislation, which is then passed with a qualified majority vote in the Council of the European Union and a simple majority in the European Parliament. D. The European Commission proposes legislation, which must then be jointly adopted by the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union through several readings, potentially involving a conciliation committee. Correct answer, D. Explanation. The ordinary legislative procedure, OLP, formerly known as the co-decision procedure, is the main legislative process by which directives and regulations are adopted in the EU. The procedure starts with a proposal from the European Commission, after which both the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union must agree on the text for it to become law. The process involves up to 3 readings and, if necessary, a conciliation committee to resolve any disputes between the Parliament and the Council, highlighting the bicameral nature of EU legislation. What role does the Committee of Permanent Representatives, COREPER, play in the EU legislative process? A. Drafting and proposing EU legislation directly to the European Parliament. B. Acting as the final arbiter in disputes between the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union. C. Preparing the work of the Council of the European Union, including negotiating texts to be discussed and, possibly, adopted by ministers during Council meetings. D. Reviewing and amending legislation passed by the European Parliament before it becomes law. Correct answer, C. Explanation. The Committee of Permanent Representatives, COREPER, plays a crucial role in the EU legislative process by preparing the work of the Council of the European Union. It consists of the permanent representatives, ambassadors, of the member states to the EU and their deputies, who meet regularly to discuss, amend, and negotiate texts before these are forwarded to the Council for final discussion and adoption. COREPER's work ensures that proposals are thoroughly examined and that the Council's time is efficiently used by resolving as many issues as possible at the ambassadorial level. Under which circumstances can the European Council become involved in the legislative process, according to the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, TFEU? A. When new legislation requires amendment or repeal of existing treaties. B. At any stage, to propose new legislation independently of the European Commission. C. To resolve disputes between the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union if legislation is stalled at the conciliation committee stage. D. The European Council is expressly excluded from the legislative process to maintain the separation of powers within the EU. Correct answer, C. Explanation. While the European Council does not typically play a direct role in the standard legislative process, it can become involved in high-level political disputes or deadlocks that cannot be resolved through the ordinary legislative procedure. This involvement is more about setting the EU's overall policy agenda and resolving political issues at a high level rather than direct legislative action. The specific scenario where the European Council would directly intervene in legislative procedures, e.g., conciliation committee stage, is not typical under the TFEU. Instead, its role is generally to provide direction or resolve critical political blockages indirectly affecting the legislative process. How does the early second reading agreement expedite the ordinary legislative procedure within the EU's legislative framework? A. By allowing the European Commission to bypass the first reading in the European Parliament if the Council of the European Union agrees unanimously on a proposal. B. Through informal trilogues that enable the European Parliament and the Council to reach an agreement on a legislative proposal before the conclusion of the second reading, potentially avoiding the need for a conciliation committee. C. By permitting member states to adopt EU legislation at a national level without waiting for the second reading, provided there is a qualified majority in favour. D. It is a procedure where the European Parliament can adopt legislation after the first reading if the European Council has not proposed any amendments. Correct answer, B. Explanation. The early second reading agreement is an informal procedure used within the EU legislative process to speed up the adoption of legislation. It involves early informal negotiations, trilogues, between representatives of the European Parliament, the Council, and the Commission. These negotiations aim to reach a compromise on a legislative proposal before the formal conclusion of the second reading. If successful, this process can avoid the more time-consuming conciliation committee stage, allowing for quicker adoption of legislation. What specific function does the trilogue process serve in the EU's legislative framework, and how does it impact the timeline of legislative adoption? A. It is a formal stage of the legislative process where the European Commission revises its proposal based on feedback from the European Parliament and the Council, significantly extending the legislative timeline. B. Trilogues are informal negotiations that take place between the European Parliament, the Council, and the European Commission to reach early agreements on legislative proposals, often accelerating the adoption process. C. It's a dispute resolution mechanism used exclusively by the European Council to expedite decisions on financial legislation, typically shortening the legislative timeline. D. Trilogues involve public debates between the 3 main EU institutions, aiming to increase transparency and public engagement in the legislative process, usually prolonging the adoption of legislation. Correct answer, B. Explanation. The trilogue process consists of informal negotiations between the European Parliament, the Council of the European Union, and the European Commission. This process aims to reach a compromise on legislative proposals, facilitating early agreements that can significantly accelerate the legislative adoption process. Trilogues allow the institutions to reconcile their positions and amendments, often enabling legislation to be adopted at an earlier reading than would otherwise be possible, thus streamlining and speeding up the legislative process. In the context of the EU's budgetary process, how is the European Parliament's role differentiated from that of the Council of the European Union? A. The European Parliament is responsible for proposing the EU's annual budget, while the Council has the final say on its adoption. B. Both institutions jointly decide on the non-compulsory expenditure of the EU budget, but only the Council decides on compulsory expenditure, such as agricultural policy funding. C. The European Parliament has the final say on the entire EU budget, including both compulsory and non-compulsory expenditures, following negotiations and agreements with the Council. D. The Council proposes amendments to the EU's draft budget, but the European Parliament is responsible for approving these amendments and has the power to reject the budget if an agreement is not reached. Correct answer. C. Explanation. In the EU's budgetary process, both the European Parliament and the Council of the European Union play crucial roles, acting jointly through a special legislative procedure. The Lisbon Treaty abolished the distinction between compulsory, e.g., agricultural spending, and non-compulsory expenditure, granting the European Parliament equal say with the Council on the entire EU budget. The Parliament can amend or even reject the budget if it does not agree with the Council's position, emphasizing its significant role in determining the EU's financial priorities alongside the Council.